So in holding the hook assembly, I simply pull the string all the way through. Not a bad idea to make some photography of how the string is put in, and set the hook assembly aside, and of course, as I mentioned before, tie it off the string. Now I backed off and backed out the boom height adjustment wheel and axle and shaft. I disconnected it from the boom and allowed the boom to drop, but I just backed this out all the way. So very, very easy construct to get it back in. Now using a nut driver, we're going to start with the top. One thing I failed to mention is that in order to complete the disassembly of the boom, I took a screwdriver and loosened the screws on these collars. And once you do that, you can pull this axle or shaft through, which is the rotating pivot point of the boom, and then begin the cleaning and polishing of those elements as well. So that allows the boom to become completely free of the platform. Once the roof is removed from the house on the revolving platform, you'll see these nuts right at the base on the revolving platform, and using a nut driver you can free those, and that allows you to remove the house from the structure and set it aside. And it also allows you access to to remove the hemispheric mount and its washer as well, and clean those. Now they're going to need to be lubricated again, because there's a lot of friction from the rotating platform sitting on top of the upper structure of the crane, the motor gearbox. Now it's held in place by these screws, which I simply reinserted in their holes. Once you undo those, you're going to be able to hold the motor assembly. So what I suggest doing, once you remove those screws from those tapped holes, is simply hold your hand under the motor assembly. Then the motor gearbox will fall down. Carefully pull the motor assembly wires through the holes in the side, right here, of the platform, up one of the legs, and into this box right here, which of course is hollow, to get the wires out of the way, mainly these, which are going to connect to your power source and your buttons, of course. Get those out of the way so that you're protecting the structure of all the wiring and you're not overhandling these single-stranded wires. So at that point, you've got the motor assembly separated. It's inside the gearbox. The wires are pulled through from having released these two screws in these tapped holes. The platform, the rotating revolving platform, was freed when you did this, and that allowed you to remove it. Now you're ready to start on something that's probably very familiar, and that is the removal of the feel, the armature, the brush bracket assembly right here, which is done by simply removing these long screws, which you'll recognize as being really the same screws you use on steam locomotives, and that allows you then to get to the gearbox. I then began cleaning, which is exactly what I do, same kind of cleaning that I do on the locomotives. This was all done by washing, including the platform. Removed a lot of household dirt, grease, fingerprints, and so forth. A little bit of polishing and washing on the wheel and its shaft. Polished the shaft, which is used to be the pivot point for the boom. And then on the motor, once these are removed, you can get to the brush bracket assembly, you can get to the feel pulls out, you can get to the armature and the commutator. And I know I say this probably a lot, and that every time I look at a commutator, it's been the dirtiest one I've ever fixed or clean, but this one I think is definitely in first place. Never seen a commutator as black as this one, and have never seen as much carbon dust down in the slots as this one. You couldn't even see the slots. I mean, you really had to look hard to see them, because the surface of the commutator, the disc commutator, was so black you could hardly tell where the plate stopped and the slot started. And then the slots were packed, I mean jam-packed up to the level of the plates with carbon dust. Not a good formula for moving forward and being successful. So I just cleaned and polished this. Now I did grind it just a little bit using my recommended method of using a sanding sponge, not sandpaper, attached to a wood block. The sanding sponge allows a very light, non-intrusive, I think, polishing or grinding of the commutator. And of course alcohol takes the bulk of it off, but that grinding really puts the shine on them, might take any anomalies out, but at least pressing it into, by holding it in a variable speed drill at low RPM and pressing this end of the axle or this end of the gear shaft into a sponge, sandpaper sponge, allows you to put very, very light pressure and be under full control. And of course, there's one space washers that came off of this. This was done as I normally do, washing and polishing. It, as you suspect, would be absolutely full of carbon dust. And I'm going to put, in mine, I'm going to put 2 new brushes. Mine were not too badly worn, but there's no reason to disassemble it this far and not put in some new components. Just like if you're going to disassemble your car all the way down the axles, might as well put some brake pads on them, right? Otherwise, you're going to be right back where you were, even if they do have some light use on them. At least you're starting at ground zero. So with that, we're ready to begin reassembly. We're ready to begin final assembly. The detailed assembly on the motor unit is complete. Field was attached. Then the brush bracket assembly. Correction, the field was attached. Then the armature was inserted. The brush bracket assembly was put on the back. The brushes, springs dropped in, and the brush caps connected to the brush bracket assembly. Everything was reattached to the house and the revolving platform, and that included the boom and the boom's pivot axle, and of course the hook assembly. And the very last thing we'll do, of course, is put the roof on the hut, and we should be ready to go.